She will be speaking on juvenile delinquency beyond conduct disorder. And as far as I know, Dr. Tobiasen has no financial disclosures. And let me tell you a few things about Dr. Tobiasen. She's presently clinical director at Pima County Juvenile Court Center. And she has been there for the last 6 years. And she has done her doctorate, master's at St. Cloud State University, St. Cloud, Minnesota. And before she came here, I think she did a lot of work there in the community, working with juvenile delinquent, working with the families. And she has been involved with teaching, education in different settings. And for the last 2-3 years, we are very fortunate to have her as our supervisor for the fellows. So she's in charge of the clinical rotation for the second-year fellows, child psychiatry fellows at juvenile court. So I'll ask her to give the presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to clarify, I've only been with Pima County Juvenile Court for over 4 years, and I did get my doctorate at St. Thomas University in St. Paul, but everything else is correct. I am pleased to be here and pleased to be able to speak, and I'm hoping to inform you a little bit about our juvenile court, how we work, and some of the mental health issues that we see coming through. My other disclaimer is this is the first time I've ever used PowerPoint, so I'm expecting the entire thing to explode on me, so you can watch me go into a fetal position when that happens. I always like to start, especially for those of you that are not familiar, with the juvenile court and kind of the key places that kids enter and where they go once they come into the juvenile court here in Pima County. First, a referral is made, usually from law enforcement, and that can result in either a paper or a physical referral. A paper referral would be similar to a ticket, like a speeding ticket, and a physical referral would be when the youth is actually taken to detention or possibly our domestic violence alternative center. If a youth is paper referred or ticketed, they can sometimes be sent to CJA, which deals with our status offenders. And our status offenders would be our truants, our curfew violators, some of our more minor charges, and those charges that would not be illegal if they were done by an adult. If a youth is brought to our detention center, they go through detention intake. At detention intake, they're given a risk assessment instrument that will determine whether they are at risk of recidivating in the next 30 days or not showing up to court. Youth that score in the medium to high range either can be detained or they can be released. And release would be to their parent or legal guardian. And usually they would be released with release conditions, rules to follow before they attend court. If the youth is detained, within 24 hours, they will have a detention hearing, they will see a judge, and that will be including weekends, holidays, and during this detention hearing, the judge will determine again whether they can be released to a parent or guardian, or if they're going to remain in detention, and if so, what their length of stay is, if that's known at that point. Now, from any referral, the petition will be sent to the county attorney's office, and you won't be tested on any of this later. Will be sent to the county attorney's office, really to determine if they want to dismiss the file, to offer diversion programming, to file a petition, or to transfer the youth to adult court for our very, very, very serious offenses. If petitions are filed, they will go to adjudication, which that would be like a trial in adult court. And at that point, the youth will either have a trial or will have a plea agreement. And at the trial, the charges will be dismissed or will be determined that it is a delinquent offense. From here, if it's determined to be a delinquent offense, it will go to disposition, which is comparable to sentencing in adult court. And the sentencing can either be a probation, a standard probation, where a probation officer would see the youth minimum of once a month. They may go into JIP supervision, which is juveniles' intensive probation, where the a probation officer or surveillance officer would see them 5 times a week. They may also be sent to the Arizona Department of Juvenile Corrections. Next, what we have is some of the most common Pima County offenses in 2009. Most common, again, are status offenses, which would be truancy, curfew, running away. Our public peace, 23.3%. Some of our disorderly conduct cases, 14% drug paraphernalia charges. Almost 13% would be misdemeanor property. And those would be the graffiti, the criminal damage, trespassing, misdemeanor person, about 10% in 2009. Those would be our domestic violence, our assault charges. Now, luckily, our most serious offenses, felony property, only about 5% of our charges. Those would be the burglaries, the car thefts, and our felony person, which would be about 3%, the ag assaults. Now, in Arizona in 2009, in all of Arizona, there were 4,955 referrals to courts across the state, and those resulted in 10,589, or 23% of kids being detained. Pima County, in the same period of time, we had 13,512 referrals, which was 161 youth that actually had the 13,000 referrals. And we detained 13% of those, or 1,164 youth. Some of the per capita Pima County outcomes between the years of 2005-2010, the juvenile population growth increased by 6.3%. With youth of color growing at higher percentages, Hispanic youth at 13%, African American youth I think at 9%, Native American youth 3%, and I think our Euro-American youth actually declined slightly. Our referral rate per 1,000 youth decreased in this 5-year period of time 21%. In addition, our average detention population in this 5-year period of time decreased 47%, and our year-to-date statistics from 2009 to 2010, we have an additional 17% decrease. Some additional demographics. Approximately 70% of our population are male, 30% female. There are national trends of increased female referrals. We're not sure if girls' behavior is different or as communities we're responding to female behaviors in different way. The good news, approximately 70% of the youth that are arrested or are referred will not return to the court, and about 30% of the youth will recidivate. And what we have learned is that most of the youth that recidivate are what we call high needs kids. In juvenile justice speak, what high needs kids means is these are the kids that come from high levels of family conflict, maltreatment. These are our substance abusers. These are our youth with mental health, behavioral health disorders, academic problems, truancy, absenteeism. These are our runaways. These are our kids that may be gang involved, hanging out with negative peer groups, histories of assaultive behaviors, and many of them are not in school. Now, kind of a history of juvenile court here in Pima County is in the 70s. There was an emphasis on diverting children from the court system. It was the first time that we separated juveniles from adults. Probation was voluntary and was used almost as prevention, and no records were kept. From the late 1970s to the early 1980s, there was therapeutic models. We started to understand we needed to understand and work with child development and the importance of working with families, that children did not exist outside of their families. During this time was the heyday of residential treatment programs and unlimited funding. This was also the era that the federal government deinstitutionalized status offenders, which really told courts that they could no longer detain status offenders. We couldn't take them in. Probation officers worked in mobile teams. They responded to homes. They worked with families to deal with youth incorrigibility, family disturbances, and these services were offered daily up until midnight. In the 80s, we saw drastic funding cuts. We saw residential treatment programs closed and juvenile crime escalated. We went into a get tough movement. This is when we first started hearing some of the media descriptions of juvenile justice as the revolving door. And I think this is also the period that we started hearing about our super predators. Everybody remember the super predators? Our lawmakers responded with law and order solutions. The transfer of juveniles to adult court became accepted practice. Pima County Juvenile Court during this era started their JIPS program, their intensive probation program, as an alternative to keep kids out of the Arizona Department of Juvenile Corrections. This is also the period that the juvenile court established alternative schools for kids that were having troubles in mainstream schools. The probation officer role moved from social worker more to officer of the court. Now, in the late 1980s to early 1990s, it was very clear that the Get Tough movement had failed. Juvenile crime was rising in frequency and severity, and so this is when we really pushed for a balanced approach. And the balanced approach that we pushed for and we still use today is one of really weighing community protection from individual accountability and competency development / treatment, making sure these kids got their needs met. This is where we started moving POs back into the schools to work with kids in the schools. Fees were established for accountability. There were renewed resources for prevention. And in 1995, it was the first time that juvenile records and court hearings were open to the public. Now, currently, some of the national concerns out of the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, the OJJDP, their major concerns right now are the misuse of detention, based on some earlier reports of overcrowding, unsafe conditions for kids, for staff, data or research that is really starting to show the harmful effects of detention for kids, especially kids that are low risk, and that's low risk for recidivism. These are kids with high needs, low risk. Second is a need for community alternatives for detention. Obviously, we can't empty our detention centers without having alternatives for that detention. And third, the disproportionate minority contact, or the DMC. And that is the data and the well-known information that youth of color are overrepresented in the court system at every single key point that they touch the juvenile justice system, and they have poorer outcomes than Euro-American kids. So Pima County delinquency initiatives, and this has been in the last 4 to 6 years. We have taken on 3 different initiatives in order to follow the best practices of juvenile justice. First is the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, the JDAI, and that's based on the work of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. The Disproportionate Minority Contact through the W. Hayward Burns Institute, the Model Delinquency Court through the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and just last year we also merged our Model Dependency Court, which deals with our CPS-involved kids. Now, all of these initiatives focus on slightly different areas, but there's a lot of overlap in these initiatives. One of the main overlaps is that all decisions in juvenile court should be data-driven. We have implemented several validated tools that will help us make decisions in order to best serve our youth. We have the Arizona Needs Assessment, which I'll talk, the Arizona Needs Assessment validated actuarial tool that will predict recidivism in the next year. The next is the Risk Assessment Instrument, the RAI, which is our detention intake instrument, again validated, that really determines the risk for recidivism in the next 30 days and the risk of the youth not showing up to court. We have also added graduated sanctions through something called our GREAT tool, which really makes sure that our sanctions for all youth are matched by their level of risk to recidivate and the severity of the offense or the behaviors that they're engaged in. We also have the MACI-2, Massachusetts Youth Screening Instrument, which helps, it's a self-reported mental health substance use screen, and it really helps us determine when kids are detained whether we need further mental health assessment and intervention when they come in. Also common in all of these initiatives is community collaboration. We work very closely with public mental health systems, CPSA, with our educational partners, with law enforcement, county attorneys, public defender's office. One of our outcomes of working with CPSA is implementing CFTs or the wraparound planning process for detained kids. The networks do come into our detention center to help plan how to get these kids out of our detention center earlier. We also look at streamlining processes. We want kids to get through the court system as quickly as they possibly can and make sure that those of us in the court are not slowing down that process. If consequences need to be offered for youth and children, we need to make sure that they get those consequences, get in and out as quick as possible. We're also currently developing a DMC intervention model. We have extensive information on the youth of color and the different rates of youth of color based on the population, where they're overrepresented, where they're not, and we are in the process of hiring some researchers to put together an intervention model that actually several people nationally will be watching very carefully. Our other initiative focuses get away from the get tough strategies, and we're really looking at rehabilitating youth and families. We're looking at therapeutic models of youth and family engagement. Our probation officers, surveillance officers, and our detention officers are all seen as coaches. Many of them have been trained in some of the motivational enhancement therapies to help motivate these kids to turn their lives around. We also are looking at improved outcomes for youth, and through that we have standardized our program evaluation processes so that we are really trying to measure, is what we're doing helping these children or harming these children? And some of the standardized pieces that we're looking at, obviously recidivism, substance use, school, and mental health. Now, one of our main tools for assessing needs of youth is through the Arizona Risk Needs. And the Arizona Risk Needs Assessment really looks at some of the actuarial criminogenic risk factors. What factors in a youth's life will lead them to come back to the court? These are family conflict, assaultive behavior, drug, alcohol use, truancy, absenteeism, school enrollment, mental behavioral health issues, delinquent peers, and runaway. I had asked our research department if we could get kind of a snapshot of where some of our current kids are across the court. And she had suggested I use the data from our electronic monitoring program, which is the bracelet that monitors whether they're where they're supposed to be. She said it was very representative of most of the kids in our court, because courts or kids from all risk levels could potentially be put on the electric monitor. So in the period between May 08 and 1209, the data of 500 youth, this would be male and female, just to kind of give you an idea of what our youth look like. On the Arizona Risk Needs, 45% had family conflict issues. Almost 64% had a history of assaultive behavior. 87% history of drug alcohol use, that would have been in the last year. 74% truancy absenteeism in the last year. Out of this particular population, 30% of our kids were not enrolled in school. 57% of our kids had mental behavioral health issues. 95% had a history of negative peer groups, whether that was spending time with other kids that are on probation or possibly gang, although I can't imagine 95% of our kids were gang involved. And 50 7% had a history of runaway. Now, our standard probation conditions for youth, these are very, very common probation conditions, which means most kids that are on probation need to follow these. These are court-ordered. No contact with other youth. That is to hopefully address the delinquent peers. They need to follow treatment recommendation. Again, we're really pushing for assessment for mental health and substance abuse issues, family conflict, and to really encourage that treatment, that follow-through. We want them to attend school, which sometimes can be very challenging if they've repetitively been thrown out of schools. Early curfew, which helps with parental supervision and also keeps them monitored during the high-risk period that most juvenile crime takes place. That would be from 4 to 8. And then on our GIPS conditions, kids have a 32-hour requirement, which means they have to account for 32 hours of pro-social activity for every week. And pro-social activities can be attending school, in treatment programs, work, or such. Now, the prevalence of mental health disorders in children. This particular chart from Schaefer and others was based on children ages 9 to 17. Showed prevalence of anxiety disorders to be about 13%, mood disorders about 6%, disruptive disorders 10%, substance abuse disorders 2%, any disorder about 21%. The juvenile justice kids look a little different than the general population. This particular study, the Northwestern Juvenile Project, was conducted by Teplin and others in 2002. And what they did is that they looked at 1,829 youth that had been arrested and detained in Cook County, that's in Illinois. They did a random sampling and structured interviews on these children and found that for disorders, any listed disorder prevalence for men or for males, almost 2/3 of the population. For girls, almost 74%. Any listed diagnosis except conduct disorder, so they pulled conduct disorder out of the diagnosing and saw that for males we still had 61% and females 70%. You can certainly see that these are much higher than the standard mental health issues in our normal population of children. That would be, I think that was more oppositional defiant disorder, which I've always found interesting that some states use different diagnoses differently and use them more prevalently. So I think that would have been the oppositional defiant disorder. Now, I had mentioned earlier that girls in juvenile justice they tend, we definitely are seeing increased rates of arrest in girls. Although nationally we are seeing a decrease arrest rate for boys, we are seeing an increase in girls. For example, status offenses, 33% versus 16%. We're also seeing increases in violent crime. And again, we don't know if that's because we're seeing and treating these girls differently as communities, as law enforcement, or if these girls are indeed becoming more violent. With our girls, we're seeing higher prevalence of depression, PTSD, higher prevalence of runaway. And what the research is suggesting with the girls that are running away is that most of the girls are running away from families rather than to boyfriends, parties, other places. With our girls, higher prevalence of family conflict and higher prevalence of being victims of violent crime. Now, as a juvenile justice system, I think many of us are struggling what to do with our girls because most of our juvenile justice programs have been developed for boys, not girls. And so we're really trying to seek the literature and try different programming. We're trying to evaluate what we're doing. Is it working for girls as it is for boys? So we are definitely a work in progress with girls. Now we also, in 2009, Frollo did a study with Pima County Juvenile Court and with our youth. And she was really attempting to look at the kids that are low risk. So these are kids that are low risk to recidivate, but they have high needs. And are they recidivating? And which kids are being sent to detention? And if they're sent to detention, are their outcomes any better, any worse? Because there was national data that really indicated that detained kids, the prognosis is much worse. So she looked at 954 youth with at least one physical referral during this time period. And remember, physical referral, kid that is brought to detention. This population, 67% male, 33% female. The average risk assessment instrument score at detention was low risk. The Arizona Risk Needs Score that talks about the possibility of recidivism in the next year was at medium risk. The most serious offense in their lifetime was likely a misdemeanor, public peace, or status offense. And what we found, I think, really surprised us out of this group. And that was on the Arizona Risk Needs. Almost 60% endorsed spending time with delinquent peers. Almost 59% reported substance use. 58% assaultive behavior. Almost 57% family conflict. 47% had a history of CPS involvement, and that would be at least one report. Maybe it was substantiated, maybe unsubstantiated. And almost 53% had a history of truancy. Now remember, these are considered our really low-risk kids. These are the kids that are first coming into our system. Now, a significant number also reported history of runaway, almost 36%. Almost 36% came in with an existing mental health diagnosis. Another 35% mental health concerns identified by somebody else. And almost 28% had special education needs. Now, out of this particular population, 52% of these kids recidivated. But when status offenses were removed, 42% recidivated. And we did find Hispanic African American youth more likely than Anglo youth to recidivate. So some of the findings from this study was that we found first that many of our low-risk youth were being detained not because they were at risk at recidivating and not because they were criminal, but because they had unmet needs. And some of the strongest predictors of recidivism or detainment were these unmet needs based on a logistical regression. So what we found is that kids that had mental health issues, substance use issues, that were 6 times more likely to recidivate. Assaultive behavior, 5 times more likely to recidivate. If they had a delinquent sibling, a brother or sister that had already been through our system or currently involved with our system, 3 times as likely to recidivate. And the younger the youth was the first time they came in, the higher rate of recidivism. As you can tell, a lot of our kids and a lot of juvenile justice-related kids have some difficulties with substance use. In 2006, there was an Arizona youth study that indicated about 41% of 8th graders, 52% of 10th graders had at least tried drugs or alcohol. In Frollo's low-risk youth study, she found that 60% of the youth that recidivated had drug alcohol issues. Data that we looked at between 2007 and 2009 in our MAC program, Make a Change program, which is our detention program that gets kids ready to engage in substance abuse treatment. This data is on our male group, 310 kids. Average age of these kids, 16.5. Average age of first use, 11.8. I think what was most surprising to us is 56% of these kids reported their first use prior to age 12, and 16% reported their first prior use prior to age 10. So I think that we're seeing younger and younger kids getting involved in substance abuse and getting in trouble. Out of this particular group, 77% used marijuana and or alcohol daily. A large percentage of these kids had not been in treatment prior to being detained, although if they had been in treatment, many of them had been in individual modalities, which leads me to believe that maybe the substance use may have been underdiagnosed, because 46% of our kids were assessed as needing inpatient substance abuse treatment. This chart really just talks about kind of the connection between problem behavior and delinquency and drug and alcohol use. And I think what is significant here is all of the values in the yes columns are clinically significant, so that we can definitely see that, depending on ages, if they are getting into trouble behaviorally or legally, a significant amount of them are reporting drug and alcohol use. Now, the other thing that we're finding, the issues that we're finding to be very, very common in our population is trauma exposure and ongoing trauma exposure. There's been quite a bit of research coming out of the National Child Trauma Network on trauma and kids in juvenile justice. And what we kind of know is that about 34% of children in the United States have experienced at least one traumatic event. But between 75 and 93% of youth entering the juvenile justice system annually have experienced some degree of trauma. And that youth of color most likely to experience victimization throughout their lifetimes. We also were involved in a dissertation study using our MACI-2 data. Even though the trauma scale is not a validated scale, it is a self-report item on the MACI-2. And what we found is that our youth that endorsed multiple trauma events, 4 times more likely to recidivate than those that had not. Obviously earlier you saw that we have a lot of school issues with our kids, absenteeism, truancy, kids not in school. We also have very high percentages of kids with special education needs. My understanding is about 12% of Pima County school-aged children have a IDEA disability, but almost 22% of our referrals to our court are kids with special education needs. Now, almost 49% of these kids can be referred before the age 11. So out of our younger kids that are referred to the court, and we do take kids as young as 8, a large percentage of them are coming in with special ed needs and difficulties. Mental retardation, about 1% of the general population, and about 13% of the juvenile justice population. I tried to get some information from our court on the number of our kids with mental retardation, and just got kind of an anecdotal discussion that probably at any time we have about 2 children detained with mental retardation at any time. What we find we desperately need in our system is comprehensive treatment. And what we find is that the diagnosis of conduct disorder or ODD, it doesn't offer a lot of guidance for treatment. I think it's not uncommon to hear, well, we can do a little behavior therapy, we can do some parent behavior training, but really nothing works, and maybe these kids just need to be handled through the juvenile justice system. But what we know about our kids, well, what we know about conduct disordered kids is they are most commonly co-occurring with other diagnoses. Very common to have depression symptoms, bipolar mood disorder, PTSD, ADHD, substance abuse, attachment disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders. And what we also know is that if these children are not diagnosed, are not aggressively treated, that if they leave school, they engage in a life of crime and substance abuse, it can be very, very costly to all of us in the long run. Now, what we know doesn't work. We have certainly learned that the Get Tough strategies don't work. Now, the trouble with these is they tend to almost be intuitive. A kid is misbehaving, we're trying to intervene, the kid continues to misbehave, let's get angry, let's get tougher and tougher and tougher. And yet what we know in our literature, we know in our experience, we also know in our parenting that getting tougher and tougher and tougher does not work with children. The other thing that can be very detrimental, the zero tolerance policies. Some of the policies, 3 strikes, you're out. Drugs on campus, immediate expulsion for the year. Some of these policies, again, can be very, very punitive, and we're tending to forget that these are children that we're working with, these are developing minds that we're working with. What we also know doesn't work, inappropriate use of detention. There have been quite a few studies that talk about the increase of mental health symptomology when kids are detained, suicidal ideation while kids are detained. We also know that when kids are detained, it can disrupt their educational processes and their normal developmental growth and development processes. We know that inappropriate incarceration doesn't work. We know that kids that are incarcerated, their outcomes are poorer as they move forward into adult. We know that adult transfer, the kids that go into adult court, extreme poor outcomes in their adult life as criminals. But what we do know is that any penetration into our system doesn't work, which is why we are very invested to keep kids out of our system as much as possible. Whether that is when the petition is first coming in, we try to divert as many of our kids as we can into diversion programming so they don't go on probation. If they're on standard probation, we have lots of processes in place to make sure they don't go on JIPS. JIPS supervision. When they're on JIPS supervision, lots of processes in place before we make or recommend a commitment to ADJC or a transfer. Now, what do we know does work? Diversion programming. As I mentioned, we like to divert a lot of our kids, and rather than have them go through the court system, we will assign consequences, maybe community service, apology letters, something pretty quick that the youth can do. They can be consequenced and closed out of our system, remembering that about 70% will not come back. Restorative justice programs do work, and those can be victim offender mediations. They can be community service requirements, accountability conferencing, anything that kind of teaches the child the effect that their behavior had on the community, others or the community. We know that targeting the dynamic criminogenic risk factors can be effective, which is why we do the assessment and we advocate in the community for treatment. Our graduated sanctions work, making sure that we really are matching the risk of that youth to the seriousness of their behavior, more so for fairness across the board and to help us manage our countertransference, as sometimes these youth can be very, very trying. Our probation officers focus on offering lots of rehabilitation opportunities. We understand that these are children, they're going to make mistakes, they're going to be impulsive, and we take that in consideration. We work very hard to coach these kids, encourage these kids to use motivational enhancement techniques, to give lots of extra chances. We know that community collaboration works, and collaboration with our behavioral health systems partners, with our educational partners, with law enforcement, our county attorney, our public defender's offices, and other community social service providers. We know that juvenile justice initiatives for reform work. Those are really considered national best practices, and here in Pima County, we're really rare that we have taken on all three of these initiatives. There aren't a lot of courts that take on any of these initiatives. We have three of them going at the same time. And then we also know what works: evidence-based, community-based treatment and resources. And that would be based on the psychiatric literature, the psychological literature, the juvenile justice literature, the child welfare literature, merging all of that literature and moving forward. Now, some of the evidence-based community treatment, comprehensive assessment of needs. Again, when a youth usually comes into our behavioral health systems, it's very easy to see the conduct disorder with our kids. They come in, parents are complaining, they're out of control, they're not following directions, they're not in school, they're fighting, they're lying, they're staying out at night. But we really need to comprehensively look at what's going on with these children. Are there additional psychiatric symptoms that need to be addressed? Is there family issues that need to be addressed? Substance use? Is there trauma? Is it ongoing? School problems? What else needs to be addressed? Comprehensive treatment and intervention plans. Obviously, best practices would be to address the mental health symptoms through psychotropic medication and evidence-based psychosocial interventions. Plus our use of evidence-based best practice treatment strategies for delinquency. Some of the best known, probably best research would be the multisystemic therapy, the MST, which I'm thrilled we have available in this community. the functional behavioral therapy, functional family therapy, the FFT. The cognitive behavioral therapies tend to be very effective to address the criminal thinking pattern of these kids. And there are several cognitive behavioral curriculum that have been shown to be effective. Substance abuse treatment, very effective in helping treat some of these children, making sure that the assessment is thorough for substance use disorders. Again, what we're finding is a large percentage of our kids are using drugs and alcohol, and a large percentage are deeply in trouble with drugs and alcohol by the time we identify that they are using. And with some of these evidence-based community treatments, also model fidelity, very, very important. Now, the challenge with most of these best practices is that they are model programs. So they can be expensive to set up, expensive to monitor. But what the fidelity research shows is that if you're going to implement one of these programs and you don't follow it to the T as it was designed, it can actually increase recidivism. So realizing the challenge of just having access to the model programs, the state of Arizona, the Administrative Office of the Courts, hired Dr. Mark Lipsey to put together a program that really looks at evidence-based treatment components rather than a model program. We call it, it's the Standardized Program Evaluation Protocol. We call it SPEP. And it's based on his research, his meta-analysis research of 600 controlled studies on the characteristics of effective programs. What he did is he put together a rating system for the programs, and those would just be the programs that we, through the court, fund. Regarding the expected effectiveness for reducing recidivism. And then what we do from there is we match services to effective treatment. So he put together all of these different components and placed them together. He looked at duration, he looked at frequency, he looked at what level of risk are most effective in all of these different program characteristics. And again, put together a rating scheme. And now his rating scheme has been validated, and the treatment providers are taking this data and they're trying to increase their programming to better address recidivism for our kids. Let me see. Here are some of the SPEP probation services that really talk about the service category or the modality, the recidivism reduction, some of the supplemental programs, duration, and frequency. And these are for some of the residential programming. Another resource for model programs would be the Blueprints for Violence Prevention. The Blueprints program has some of the most rigorous criteria for measuring what works. In order to be a model program, these programs had to have been evaluated through experimental design, random assignment, and had multiple evaluations. And so it does list several programs that have been found effective either for delinquency prevention or delinquency treatment. And then for further information, I did give you some websites the University of Colorado's Blueprints for Violence Prevention, the OJJDP model programs. And the OJJDP model programs, they identify effective and promising prevention programs. They provide descriptions of each of the programs, identify problem behaviors, and the populations that these programs best meet. And then for anybody more interested in the SPEP protocol that we've implemented in Arizona, the website is offered. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you very much. I have one question. Like the MSD, which we contract from Providence, the MSD here.
Yes.
Do you have any kind of oversight, or do you get any data from them?